Today I am with Marianne Snow, and it's going to be a very interesting conversation I'm looking forward to, because I've been learning about safety and security when you work remote, when you don't work in your office, and everything is going on today with the pandemic, that this is the direction that we're going, that we are. And you have such an interesting company and companies founded a while ago, and you are just focused on this remote work. Thank you for being.
My pleasure. It's wonderful to be with you today.
So the interesting, and I always go through the LinkedIn profiles of my guests and I see what they've been up to until now. And the interesting part, of course, is that you have been working in the restaurant business for a long time. And I think, if I read it right, you have been involved mostly into training.
Learning and development and organizational development. So
Yes.
was looking at learning solutions and organizational development and change management for a very long time.
Right. So how did you get there from studying English?
So it's interesting transitions, right? Career paths that are not linear. And when I was studying liberal arts as a liberal arts student, one of the things my professors always used to say to me was that the advantage of a liberal arts education was it was based in critical thinking. So much of the study that I was doing at that particular point was about problem solving. It was understanding how to communicate in the world, the basis for things like emotional intelligence, getting in touch with not only who you were and conveying that and communicating it, but also being able to interact with others and to find ways to build rapport. And so these things were interesting social dynamics. And so not very surprising, I started teaching, but teaching is a profession that doesn't always compensate you well. And so I started working in the hospitality field, happened to be in restaurants, because I needed to supplement my income as an educator. And that became a career path because, not very surprisingly, people learned that I had communication and education skills, that I was a competent critical thinker and problem solver. And I have built a career on saying yes. So when people came to me and said, would you do something? I said, sure, I'll try that. Yes, I will do that. And I was very, very fortunate to have opportunities to grow into larger organizations. And as the problems became more complex, that became a very interesting piece of work for me. And so my entire career is based on problem solving, change management, looking for ways to improve communications and collaboration. And it went from a very small, those very small interactions to something that was regional, then national, then international. And now you and I are talking.
But that's why I always like to go back to these things, because it's so interesting how, like you said, how it's not linear and how you stumble into these things, and especially when you always say yes on opportunities, that it brings you onto these always very different, interesting paths.
I think, there's a couple of things, right? I think that the first thing is I'm curious by nature. And because I'm curious by nature, when I come into a circumstance, my default position is to be curious as opposed to be judgmental. And so I tend to sit back and look at the situation that I'm presented with as an opportunity to learn and also to connect with things that I may be unfamiliar with. And so I've always been quite comfortable as someone who was capable in my disciplines, but also was very, very interested in other people and how they interact and how they do stuff. And I just have a very simple philosophy. And the simple philosophy is every person I meet is a friend I haven't met. And so because every person I meet is a friend I haven't met, and I'm curious by nature, and I like hearing people's stories, then this has afforded me an opportunity to really meet great people, to get involved with really interesting things, and really build a career that has given me a lot of privileged contact with folks.
I like that philosophy. I like it a lot. That I think that's no. I think it's the main reason I started my podcast a couple of years ago, because that's what I am. I'm very interested in, and I love talking to people and to learn about what moves them and how they go. So then you, as the way I see it, you went back to the thing that you started with, is going study or teaching again. You became an adjunct professor, and why this shift? Because you've been working into the hospitality for what's it, 16 years or so.
It was 15 or so years, and then I transitioned industries. So I made a major shift. I started working in international finance, and again, part of that was because the organization that I was working with, which was an international financial service company, had a presence all over the world, but they were very interested in the work that I had been doing to connect people with technology, to figure out ways to convey information and create learning experiences using technology. And it was very early stages because at that point it was the late 90s, and suddenly I was working for an organization. I had been doing it before that, but I had been doing it before that with much smaller budgets. But in the financial services, it was very early days for a lot of the technologies that seem so natural today, that are so available today. But suddenly I could run video conferencing events. I could create learning, very centralized learning experiences through learning management system technologies that were very, very early in the stages. And so I was brought on to that organization to build a learning university that served 28,000 people in 32 countries, which was a really interesting problem. And a lot of people didn't want to take on that challenge. And for me, that was actually a fabulous challenge. We were very successful. I was very successful. I pulled together a team of people. We were able to create something that was very meaningful to that organization. And then I was given the challenge to create to curate a professional suite of tools to enable remote work through distributed teams in very regulated environments. So now I had to figure out how to not only connect people using technology, but to do it in highly regulated industries. So I was able to do this and learned a great deal, worked with companies like Microsoft that were at the very early stages of SharePoint, their SharePoint product. And then what happened after 2008, clearly there was a disruption in the financial economy of the globe. And so in 2009, the financial service company was starting to defund a lot of the forward-thinking projects that I was involved with. And at that point, I didn't want to give up the work that I'd been doing. And so I left corporate business. I started teaching at a business institution that asked me to start working with students at a point in time where Facebook wasn't Facebook, WhatsApp wasn't WhatsApp, WeChat wasn't WeChat. None of this stuff existed. And so I had an unprecedented opportunity to have small groups of students where we were literally creating the jobs. My students were graduating out of the classes and going out and becoming the first digital marketers. And we were creating the jobs and really curating a lot of those things at that point. And that was very, very interesting.
I can imagine. I can imagine. What does it mean? Because you talked about in its regulated industry. What does that mean?
At the time, financial services, I was working with an organization that had multiple lines of business, many, many lines of business, and they had relationships across the globe. And so not only were we dealing with the United States versions of privacy, but, Canadian version of privacy, the EU's version of privacy. And at that moment, I started to learn that the world actually had hundreds of definitions of privacy at a moment where technology was starting to shift, right? There was a global economy that was very robust, that was very interconnected, and yet as you transversed, moved from one geography to another geography, people had different business requirements, they had different industry requirements, and so we were suddenly working to think about how do you bring and enable a global team of people to be able to work together, not only, and it was also really interesting because it's not only inside of a firewall, inside of a company, but you also had to think about ways that you could integrate outside entities, whether it was a merger and acquisition, whether it was a new client integration. And suddenly you had a circumstance where I was not unique in this. There were a lot of companies that were thinking about these problems, but you had to suddenly go from learning and development to thinking about business partnerships, to thinking about business relationships, to thinking about the technical considerations that were associated with this, because we're navigating technology. So what does a firewall look like? And how do you enable work back and forth in that technical environment, but in the business regulatory environment, in the competitive business landscape environment, and then how do you do it with humans? Because we were also interested in enabling people with the skills to be able to do this so that they could maintain the security of an organization and still be able to collaborate effectively, because this was my communication background, my education background, my my liberal arts background, where you still had people dealing with people, and so many layers, and it was very complex, but it was fascinating and exciting and very, very interesting to work.
I can see because you started teaching and at the same time you started your own business. Um, on the digital strategy side. So you took care of the online presence of companies.
Hmm.
Um, but I'm not sure, but somehow you were still also drawn by this, um, all this remote kind of things and teams working together remotely and all this interaction was going on.
Hmm.
Because in 2015 you started Sophia. I'm not sure how you pronounce it.
Yeah, Sophia.
Sophia.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't think you are. You look for opportunity, but you don't look for more work, right? But you just start another business when you're in this one business.
Well, I would say, necessity is the mother of invention. Yes, where I want you to think about what was happening in 2008 and 2009, with the global economy. And it was also the very beginning stages of what was happening with digital media, right? And so while I had clients that were quite interested, because you always have early adopters who are thinking about how do you integrate digital into business your business framework, because I wasn't a marketer. That wasn't my goal. I'm a business person at heart. I enjoy operations. I enjoy execution. And so the types of organizations that I was working with was, they were small to mid-size and sometimes large businesses that were thinking about, like, for example, I'd worked with an international pharmaceutical company that had distributed teams. They were trying to, they were trying to maintain their costs and not have to have people travel quite as much. And this was still early 2000s, but they're trying to contain costs. And they had the technology which would allow them to be able to bring teams together virtually. So you'd have some people in one room, other people in another room, or you had groups of managers and leaders who had to manage distributed teams where they might have people in multiple geographies, in multiple time zones. And what did that mean from a team interaction point of view? And so these were the types of projects that I were focused on. And not everybody was prepared for that. And so, the digital strategy was one piece of it. And I provided that service. My team and I provided that service because we had some clients interested in those areas. We were also I was very interested in continuing the work that I'd been doing at the financial service company because it was relevant. But I sit at an intersect that is a little more on the cutting edge, you know? And so very often I'm a pioneer or a frontier person. I'm in a position where I am very much in an education mode until, say, for example, a pandemic comes along and suddenly people are forced into those circumstances, and they're forced into those circumstances in ways that were unimaginable before. And so digital is such a big portion of remote work and distributed teamwork that it was an important intersect, because you have the technology platforms and the technology tools. But for me, the interesting problem is how people interact on those. But there's such an interesting dynamic happening all over the world, because privacy is being redefined. How data is, I have always said to my students, if it's free, you're the product. And yet at the same time, we both know that the EU has a distinctly unique position on privacy, very rightly so, based on its history and its interests. United States takes a completely different perspective. The Middle East, a completely different perspective. China, various parts of the world take their own unique perspective. And that was endlessly fascinating to me. So there are just so many intersects. And I think, as we think about career shifts and as we think about how we interact in the world, I think it is quite easy to create career boxes where we start to define ourselves in one particular way. But I think sometimes the evolution comes because the world has decided it's going to shift and you have a choice. If you want to maintain job relevance, then you maintain a certain forward thinking process and you acknowledge when things are shifting in your industry or in your company or your segment. And then there are other people, I think, who are like myself, who are just really curious and enjoy the challenge of learning things new and continuing to evolve their thinking. And that has always been really a big driver for me, is to maintain relevance, but to also be forward thinking and to try and anticipate, but to do it in the discipline I love, which is the people interaction, how people interact.
Right. I have a couple of things that I want to ask you now. It's always difficult because I have like three directions now. um, let's let's continue with this thought that you were just explaining, because you were talking about all these various different kind of views on privacy all over the world.
Mm,
And then you talk about all these collaborations of teams. Um, that's that's you've been working on that part for a long time.
mm.
So what is the most interesting insight that you got from that?
I think, first of all, I would say that there are the there are far fewer people thinking about privacy, talking about privacy, actioning on privacy at the global level than should be doing that. And I think that that's it's to a certain extent, and whether you're talking about an entity like the UN, whether you're talking about an entity like NATO, something that is bigger than just one region, because the internet is a global phenomenon and privacy and technology is a global phenomenon. There are a lot of government actors that are associated with it, really defining how different geographies are taking on the topic of privacy. Are they using it for sovereign surveillance? Are they using it as a means to safeguard their constituents? Are they, there's so many different perspectives right at this point in time, but I don't see anybody working on it at a truly global scale. And that I find that a little bit disturbing, in the sense that privacy by definition, in these particular environments, it's almost like the old story of the frog who is in the water, and if you turn it on slow enough and you allow the water to come to a boil on a slow enough pace, then people acclimate. And I would argue that even today, even with some of the stringent guidelines in countries like the EU and Canada, which have really led the conversation around personal privacy in many ways, certainly have a little bit more of a user-centric view than most regions of the world. And yet, Siri is still Siri, Alexa is still Alexa, data is still being gathered, coming up against big conglomerates, behemoths like a Google, or a conglomerate, or a big entity like, say, for example, Alibaba, I mean, you get into such large amounts of money, and these companies have now got critical mass, and they're dictating a lot of things. And whether we're talking about Facebook, and we're talking about something like, I mean, Facebook owns WeChat, Facebook owns Instagram, just buy your competition. So there's a lot of conversation about, how these companies are utilizing data and getting to the point where they have so much information about human behavior. What are they going to do with that, and how is it going to translate itself? These are things that I think we should be talking about at a much higher level as a global community, and I don't see that happening.
Yeah. My next question was going to be, what do you think is the most difficult thing that we're looking forward to? But I think you already answered that with this. Because,
Data, it's all about the data, right? I
yeah,
mean, at this point, we have given away so much, and even countries that have constructs that are much more user centric and are much more stringent. Even data is data, and human behavior is human behavior, and we're much more universal than we think. And while we might sit in different geographies, and we might speak different languages, we might have different cultures and different beliefs, there are certain universal factors. When a woman is pregnant, her body acts in a particular way. There's a great example, right? Or if you have parents with children, there's a certain universal feeling towards children. These are universal standards. And so that data, regardless of how it's collected, when it has to do with human biology, or human just interactions, or their reactions to things, these large technology companies are now making they are making products because that's how they make their money. They're making products based on that data, based on how we humans interact, and that's something that is both fascinating and terrifying all at the same time.
I agree. Yeah, fascinating and terrifying. That's it. What do you, and because you have three companies, right? You have Sophia, you have Remote
Mm,
Nation, you have the Remote Nation Institute where you teach.
yes.
And Remote Nation is a company that sells products.
Mm.
So what do you tell your clients and their remote teams about privacy and security?
When we talk to any of our clients, and Sophia is our business consulting company, where we work with organizations to help them launch remote programs, to optimize distributed teams, and really think about how they're going to use remote work and distributed teams as a strategy. There are three legs of the stool. One of obviously has to be the people interactions, how people interact, and what business skills they need to be able to be successful in these environments. One is operations process, and what are the workflows and the structural constructs that need to exist in order to be able to support those humans. And then you have the technology piece, and the technology piece is going to be the enabler, because you can't have global teams, you can't have remote work without the technology platforms. And when you're examining the technology platforms, we're not just talking about, first of all, connectivity. Can somebody get online? But we're talking about, how do they get online? What device are they going to use, right? And what software and what platforms. And in the United States, just recently, we have experienced quite a wake-up call, because we have major security breaches where folks have discovered some government actor. There are some suspicions around that, but some government actor that has cracked into the U.S. government systems, and probably did it through software that was used for basic updates, so there's lots of different ways to kind of think about things from a privacy point of view, right? You've got not only the software itself, but devices, which are imperfect, the user, which is imperfect, and then also the workflow and the work process, which could be imperfect. And so, as you're thinking about privacy, you have to think about all of these considerations. And I would argue that even if you're sitting in a co-located office situation, much more traditional, if you're using technology systems and you have workflows that are gathering information or connected with other things, then you still have people, you've still got people running those systems, and the problems still exist, but they just exist differently.
Is it part of your, or will it be part of the education that you do for these people that work remote?
It has to be. And, I mean, I think you have to, there's a couple of things, right? From a strategic point of view, how do you educate the senior leadership that are making decision makers within an organization that are enabling the business strategies, adopting those business strategies, budgeting for those business strategies, allocating resources for those strategies. You have to educate at the top levels, but then you also have to work with the operations crew to be able to help them think through some of the logistics. And then you have to work with the workforce, because the workforce is implementing those things, and they're also interacting with each other. So it's an education process to give them a higher sense of what the critical concerns are, but also how do you put together a a business skill set that allows them to be able to interact as humans effectively on a team basis, because teams that trust each other, teams that work efficiently with each other, are more likely to acknowledge that there's an issue, ask a question if they have a concern, raise the issue that they may need some help or support with something, or that something seems odd or off. So it is a shift in thinking that has to be quite systemic, because these types of organizations just run differently. And in the current construct, one of the things that we're spending a lot of time doing is helping people who became remote organizations through a pandemic necessity, as opposed to a planful strategic way, because these folks did it, and they did it very quickly, which means speed and will it work were the top priorities, not is this safe, is this strategically advantageous, are my people ready for this, and do I have a planful rollout strategy that has been thoughtfully evaluated.
What do you think is the next big issue that's coming up in the next couple of months on because of the shift? Like you said, it was a necessity, speed, getting all these people to work from home, to pick up their screen and to pick up the laptop, and having a secure connection. But what is the next phase that you see that will happen?
So the Remote Nation Institute, which is our learning institution, is also our research institution. And earlier last year, we did a global survey to start gathering data around people's state of mind, and also some of the mental shifts and the social shifts that are happening around people's interest in remote work, working from home, if that's a possibility. Because obviously That's not always a possibility, but there are many, many, many more jobs that are accessible to remote work situations than have ever been considered before. And one of the things that we found was that even when we are post-COVID, even when we go past the pandemic, people are going to have an appetite for having more flexibility in their work schedules. And so organizations, what we're recommending to our organizations and to the business community at large is they should be evaluating their organizations now to find out which positions are going to lend themselves to remote work in the future, because there's going to be a pushback from the global workforce that if it's possible to have that flexibility, because the pandemic has been the proof of concept globally that this is possible, then when the pandemic has passed and people are able to come back into the office, they're going to immediately say to their bosses, I want flexibility. I want to be able to work from home 1 to 2, 2 to 3 days a week. And some people are going to say, I would prefer to work from home all the time. And how is a company going to respond to that? And in order to accommodate that, now it's time to do the evaluation, to think about the operational structure, to create the employee life cycle changes that are necessary to support it from a policy point of view, from a employee life cycle point of view, and then the technical and security considerations that would enable it. So the faster they start thinking about that now, the better off they're going to be.
I agree. Um, and you talked about teams. You have a new book coming up, which is called 30 Hacks for Managing Remote Teams. But the book that people can already purchase is 30 Hacks for Productive Remote Workers. And it's divided in 5 parts. And one of them is mental health. And I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that. So what is important about this part? I understand it's really important, but why? What is the most important hack in that section? Let's put it that way.
I think, and to a certain extent, or no, I would say that you have 2 things. One is, sort of pre-COVID and post-COVID, right? Before the pandemic, part of the challenge that people who were working remotely had was that very often their organizations looked at them with suspicion and just assumed that if they were out of sight, that they were unproductive, which is something that is clearly incorrect, because the world has proved that remote work is a completely legitimate way to work. I would say we also have a tendency to over romanticize the office. We assume that if we can see someone that they are productive, and we know that that's not true too. People can go to an office and be as distracted and unproductive and as somebody in a remote setting. And I would argue that remote workers tend to be a little more conscious and productive because they don't have some of the in-office distractions. Mental health with COVID, however, is a little bit different. So before the pandemic, mental health had to do with setting good boundaries, because in a remote work setting, you felt so guilty. You wanted to prove that you were a good professional. So you never said no. You always said yes, no matter what. And if you're working in an international team, that can be quite tricky, because what if you're working in an international team where you have colleagues all over the world and they think that they can call you at 3:00 in the morning your time, or text you at 3:00 in the morning your time. And so really looking for building good supports so that there were good boundaries and just really important structures in place so that you could demonstrate your performance because you met the expectations that you set with your boss. You met those expectations and lived within your boundaries. This still happens post-COVID, with the pandemic, but it's different. Now it's about a combination, and it is about maintaining human connection in the pandemic world where we can't physically connect in the same ways. So I know that we're doing a lot of live stream events and a lot of live stream programs where we are not only coming together as a group and creating a safe space so that people can talk candidly about some of their struggles, and what it's like to apply the remote work skills in today's environment where the social support systems are non-existent. But it's also important because folks have to accommodate things that they would never accommodate before. And we all know this is quite atypical in the pre-pandemic period, where the BBC commentator whose child happened to wander into the video frame and became a meme was such a novelty. And now you can't have a meeting without a small person sitting on their parent's lap, because there are no social structures for childcare. And having a pet join you, a significant other join you, a child join you is just part of the conversation. And so creating those human moments and allowing people, accommodating and normalizing these things is a really important piece of the puzzle right now. And that's the way we're going to survive this. It's by maintaining a sense of humor and allowing for things that were not allowable before.
So it's all back to the beginning. It's all back to interconnecting people, problem solving. Um, it's about it's back to school for you. It's back to the original education that you had. And it's so interesting. So to look back now and see how your career, how your work, how your company evolved, uh, and how everything is connected at this point. It's beautiful to see. Marianne, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your ideas, and also your insight about what the future of security and privacy looks like, and about how what we should do this on a global kind of platform or idea. Thank you very much.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Thanks so much, Arno.